Hope you continue to read in the story where we're at this week. If you read this week, you probably realize that this is kind of an interesting book. And what I mean by that, it's not really like many, if any, of the books of the Bible. It's kind of unique in of itself. And you can even start to kind of wonder when you're reading the book of Ruth, why did God include this book? Why did he include the book of Ruth? I mean, there's nothing miraculous that happens. There's not anything about Israel as far as a nation in it that really comes forth to play. And so you begin to think, why would God include this little book about this little foreign woman in the time of the Judges in this grand story of his that we have in the Bible? Why include Ruth? I mean, really, at its core, all Ruth is a love story. It's a love story. It's a love story between a mother and the daughter-in-law that stayed with her. And it's a love story between a man and a woman. That's what it is. In fact, in my research here, when I was reading and watching some stuff on the book of Ruth, one of the people called it the chick flick of the Bible. That's what Ruth is. It's the chick flick of the Bible. And I don't know if it fully meets that, but it's for sure at least a Hallmark TV movie, isn't it? That's kind of what it is. It's that feel-good story that looks like everything's going to turn out bad, and it turns out good in the end. It's a Hallmark movie. In fact, in the famous verse, one of the most famous verses from the book of Ruth, we even use this for love stories. In fact, I'd like to read this verse to start off today, and that's Ruth chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. And there's a part of this verse that you'll probably recognize right away. But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you from me." I can almost guarantee that you've probably heard those words before, even if you've never read Ruth. Because it's one of those verses that's often used at weddings. It's often used at weddings between a bride and a groom. And while the sentiment, I'm not saying is a bad thing for there, I think in context, if we're using that wedding, it should be that the wife, the future wife, turns to her mother-in-law and says that to her. But as we know, that's not probably going to happen. In fact, often one of the relationships that's the most strained is between the mother-in-law and her daughter-in-law. Yet that's the very first love story that we run into here in the book of Ruth. And so whenever we're starting to ask ourselves, why is this book included? I think we first need to understand what Ruth is really all about. We first need to understand what this book is all about. And the first thing that Ruth is all about is Ruth is a story about dealing with loss. Ruth is a story about dealing with loss. That's the very first thing that the book of Ruth is about. In fact, the first chapter, that's kind of what it's all about. It's about dealing with loss. You see, you saw the video, and in the video you had this husband and wife that they're experiencing famine in the land of Bethlehem. And some commentators would say that they may even lacked a little bit of faith by moving to a foreign land. And so they weren't necessarily trusting God in that moment by moving to a foreign land. And when they got there, they had these children, and they married foreign women, which in the eyes of Israel was not something that was looked very kindly upon. And so we begin to wonder, are these people really looking to do what God wants them to do? Yet in those times, whenever they experience great loss because Naomi's children die and her husband dies, and she's left with these two daughter-in-laws, nowhere to turn, and she doesn't know what to do. And so she decides in that moment, I'm going to move back to Bethlehem. And in fact, if we read the text, we see that she even changes her name. She changes her name to a name that means bitterness, because God isn't with her. At least that's how she feels. She feels like God has abandoned her and that all she has left in life is bitterness. And so she might as well go back to where she's from and die alone. That's kind of the sentiment that we see in Naomi. She's experienced great loss, and because of it, she's depressed and bitter, and she doesn't know where to turn to. And so she tells her daughter-in-laws, leave me, stay here where you have family. They've experienced loss too. Take care of yourselves. And one of them does. But then we have Ruth. We have Ruth that decides to stay. And you see, sometimes in our moments of loss, our moments of when we don't know where to turn to, it's an unexpected person that helps get us through it. It's someone unexpected. And I believe that Ruth was someone unexpected for Naomi. I don't think she thought that her daughter-in-law would leave the family that she knew, the friends and family she knew in Moab, and go to a place she had never been to live with her mother-in-law. Yet, that's where these words come into play, as I read earlier. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, there I will stay. I will die where you die. Just don't ask me to leave you. And it's Ruth. She could have left. I mean, she was dealing with her own loss, and probably in her own mind would have loved the comfort and support of her own family and friends. But instead, she stays with Naomi, someone who's dealing with bitterness and loss, and probably not necessarily a fun person to be around. I'm sure you've experienced loss before. And if you're like me, when you experience loss, you're probably not a fun person to be around. You're probably not one that has much to give to someone else. Yet we see Ruth here giving endlessly to Naomi. Giving to her and helping her and remaining faithful despite the loss that she has experienced. So this is a story about dealing with loss. We have Naomi dealing with loss by getting embittered and depressed. And we have Ruth dealing with loss by helping others. So we see these two pictures of two people dealing with loss. And so we start asking ourselves is, how do I deal with loss? Where do we turn to? And when I looked at this in my own life and started thinking about how do I deal with loss? My natural instinct is to bottle up. My natural instinct is to recede and get depressed and not handle it well. But fortunately, I've had some good people in my life that have taught me that whenever you experience loss, sometimes is when you need to be around people the most. When you need to search people out the most. And so often when I've experienced loss, as I've shared before in my sermons, if you've been here, but whenever I was going through my divorce, when my ex left and I was trying to win her back, I made myself be around other people. I would not allow myself to just stay and have a pity party and be depressed. I had to be around other people. And one of the people that actually helped me the most was an unexpected source. And it was a boss of mine that I had at the time. I was assistant manager at a pizza place, and she was my manager. And she had actually done to an ex what my wife had done to me. And yet, because of that, and the regret that she had because of that decision of her life, she was very supportive of me. And actually said, I wish I could take that back every day, but I can't. And so she helped me instead. And now it didn't end up working out, but because this person had done wrong in their own life, they were able to help someone else. It wasn't a source I really expected. I didn't expect someone like that to just come out of the woodwork and help me. But she was able to help me. And sometimes by being around other people and immersing ourselves in with others, we get that help from other people. We get that help from people that we would never expect. And I believe that's what Naomi got from Ruth. She got something that she never expected. And even in this story of Ruth and Naomi, we see a question answered here. We see a question of who do we put our trust in? And whenever we recede and we only think about what we're going on in our life and we don't pour ourselves away from people, often what happens is we're only really trusting ourselves. And I believe that Naomi was doing that. She was only trusting herself. She wasn't trusting anyone around her. And more importantly, she wasn't really trusting that God would put the right people in her life and take care of her in the right way. Instead, she was retreating away from everyone. Ruth, on the other hand, did not see it that way. She instead trusted God. She even said that I will worship the gods you worship. She was willing to worship the one and only God and follow him out of faithfulness to Naomi. That is where Ruth put her trust in. Put her trust in the one true God. And she put her trust in other people. And I believe that's a lesson for us. Ultimately, how we handle loss is ultimately determined by who we trust. If you don't trust anyone, or you only trust yourself, the way you handle loss probably isn't going to be very well. But when we trust others and we trust God, the way we handle loss, while still hard, not saying that it won't be hard, but it becomes a little more manageable to handle. And so the first thing we have to understand about Ruth is that it's a story about dealing with loss, but it is also a story about a guardian redeemer. Now you may have heard this in older translations, they call this a kinsman redeemer. So guardian redeemer, kinsman redeemer, the name is the same. It doesn't mean the same thing no matter what. And basically what that means is that this was a relative that could come back and buy the family land if the land had no heir. You could buy the family land if the land had no heir, so that way it stayed within the family. And if there was a widow available, a widow there, he would then marry that widow if he could, if he wasn't married to someone else, and provide an heir to that land. And whenever they had a child, that child would then inherit the land they had. Now this seems foreign to us. This seems different to us because it's not part of our culture. It's not the way we operate, really. But it'd be kind of like to wrap our hands around this. Imagine that you're a farmer, and if you're a guy, you die. So sorry about that. But you're a guy, and your wife is left without any children. No heir to take the farm. And so what you have is a brother or a close cousin who's single would then say, I will buy your family farm. I will purchase that farm for you, and I will take your widow as my wife. Because I want to make sure that your name, that your land does not have, or that it will always have an heir. I want to make sure that your land always has an heir that will rule over it. And so that's the culture that we were in. And this person was called a guardian or kinsman redeemer. And this is the story, the second love story that we see in Ruth. This is the second story. The story of Boaz and Ruth. You see, when they got to Bethlehem, when Ruth and Naomi got there, they needed something to get food. And Israel had a law that if you dropped 3 or fewer pieces of grain, you left them. Now, if it was 3 or more, you could pick them back up and put them in. But the reason why they left them, if the harvesters dropped them, was for the poor and needy. They thought, if you only drop 1 or 2, just leave it, so someone else can come up and pick it up, and they will have food to eat. And so Ruth was going along, and she was picking up those 1 or 2 pieces of grain, because she didn't have enough. Her and Naomi didn't have any means to gain any ability to get food for themselves. And so this was really their only way of providing for themselves, was picking up this grain that was left by the harvesters. And she just happened to be that the field that she went into belonged to a man named Boaz. And Boaz was a good man. Boaz saw someone in need and thought to himself, I want to help her out. When he found out who she was and what she had done for Naomi, he said, I want to make sure she has plenty. And so he provided for Ruth. Gave Ruth exactly what she needed. He made sure that Ruth had all the grain she needed. And told his other workers, if you see this lady coming about, don't stop her. Allow her to get as much as she needs. He even fed her and made sure they had food. And Ruth racked up everything that she had for food and took the rest leftovers home so Naomi could have something. And she gathered up all this grain. And when she got home to Naomi, Naomi was shocked at how much grain she had. Shocked at how much that she'd been provided for. And she began to think, who in the world took care of you? What field did you go to? When Ruth told her, she said, God is at work here. God is at work here because that person is a relative of ours. He's a relative who could potentially be your Redeemer. And so tells her to continue to go back and do anything that Boaz tells her. And so Ruth does that. Does everything that Boaz tells her to do. And eventually, as she's going home, Naomi comes up with this plan that they will try to kind of force the issue. Because Boaz apparently had cold feet or whatever and wasn't moving along as quickly as Naomi would have liked. And so Naomi pushes the issue and tells Ruth to go into Boaz's bedroom, uncover his feet, which would have been a sign of submission, saying, I give myself to you, showing that I will put myself underneath your care. And in doing so, Boaz realizes that it is his responsibility to be the Redeemer. But there's someone in between. There's someone in between them because there's one closer. So first he has to clear that hurdle. And so he clears that hurdle to the point that he's allowed to then buy the land, marry Ruth, and take care of her. And in fact, in all this, even though Boaz is the one taking care of Ruth, you see the humility of a godly man in him because he doesn't see himself as the one taking care of Ruth. He actually sees himself as fortunate to have her. You see a godly man who loves Ruth. He tells Ruth even that you could have gone after a younger man, but instead you came to me. He feels fortunate, and he's humbled by her. And in doing so, he saves her. Because the life for a woman with no husband in that day and age was pretty much life with a beggar. And so by doing that, she saved her from a life of begging for food and water and everything else. And that was the redemption that she received. Now this is kind of foreshadowing the redemption that we will receive. You see, Jesus is our Redeemer. We've heard this before. It's one of his names. It's one of his titles that we give him. He is the Redeemer. And you see, we are foreigners to God. And we are foreigners to God because we have sin in our lives, and that separates us from him. It makes us not naturally ones that he would care for. But because he loves us, and because he wants to be with us, much like Boaz wanted to be with Ruth, he's willing to pay the price that he has to pay, even though we are unworthy. To be honest, Ruth didn't deserve Boaz's treatment. She didn't deserve it because she was a foreigner, and in that day and age, that's not how they treated foreigners. She just didn't deserve his kindness and mercy. Much in the same way that we do not deserve the kindness and mercy of God, yet he gave his Son on the cross to redeem us. He gave his Son on the cross to pay the price of our sin so we may receive redemption. He was willing to pay any price needed so that way we could have what was originally meant for us, and that is a relationship with God. That's what he wanted for us. And so that's why he sent Jesus. And so you can already see how Ruth is starting to become a little more important. Starting to see how this is foreshadowing a greater Redeemer to come. But then I think there's one more thing that kind of plays a part in this. One more thing that makes us understand exactly what Ruth is all about. And that is that Ruth is a story of God creating his upper story. Now we talk about this. We have the lower stories, which are our stories, or the stories of the individuals in the Bible. And then we have God's upper story, which is one continuous story that he is creating and molding to do what he ultimately wants to do, and that's to send Jesus to die for our sins. And we already talked about how he is foreshadowing this through Boaz, but I believe there's something even deeper here that God is doing by molding and making this his story. And why it makes it so important. And we see this through one of the most boring parts of Scripture, and that's genealogies. I don't know if you're like me, but half the time that I'm reading Scripture, I skim, if not skip over genealogies, because ultimately they're boring. You're like, do we have to read this? But there are moments when a genealogy matters. And Ruth is one of those moments. And so we see this in Ruth chapter 4. Ruth chapter 4, we see this genealogy of what's going to happen. And so we pick up in verse 21. I'm not going to read the whole thing because, like I said, they are kind of dry and boring. So we're just going to pick up on a very important part here. We see Salmon, the father of Boaz, Boaz, the father of Obed, and Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of David. David, the man after God's own heart, the future king of Israel, in his line is a Moabite. This foreign woman who showed faithfulness to Naomi, who didn't really matter to the Israelites, who wasn't really important, who was ultimately unworthy, who was only around because someone took care of her, is in the line of King David. And that's important. That's important. Yes, it may not seem like it was important at the time because all they did was had a son, and the son's name was Obed. They had no idea that this son would eventually be the grandfather of one of the greatest kings that the Israelites would ever have. They had no idea. Yet God was molding and creating something behind the scenes to raise up another person no one would look at to do great things. And that was David, the last of 7 sons, the smallest. Whenever Samuel, when we'll get to this and another thing, when sees him, says, surely that's not the one who's going to be king, right? Because we had all these others who were big, strong men, surely one of them. Yet it was David, this small boy, who would become king. Where God would continue to show that He is the one in charge and He will use the most unlikely of people to do amazing things. And one of those unlikely people is Ruth. He would use Ruth and the love story, this Hallmark TV movie, to bring about something amazing. In fact, so amazing that for many of you, you know that David is the ancestor of Jesus. And so not only was Ruth in the line of David, this Moabite woman, this foreigner, but she is in the line of Jesus. And it's not just that. In fact, I believe that Boaz was accepting of Ruth for a very specific reason. And that specific reason is that Salmon's wife, the father of Boaz, was Rahab, a foreigner in a land that helped spies get into Canaan. A foreigner who was a prostitute, who had no right to be loved by an Israelite, yet she was, and she was accepted. And this meant that in this line of David, in this line of Jesus, is a Canaanite prostitute and a foreigner widow from Moab. And we see this in Matthew. In the genealogy of Christ, in Matthew chapter 1 through 5 and 6, it says this. And here it says, Salmon, we've already talked about this, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of King David. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. We see the importance of here. And many of you may be thinking, well, how do we know it's the same Rahab? If you look in the genealogy of Christ, there's very, very few women mentioned. And they only mention women that they know people will know. And that's why they mention Rahab and Ruth, because they're important. You see these two foreigners who really had no right to be loved, yet were. And in this, God creates something amazing. God creates something that will change the world forever. And that is that He creates a lineage of Christ that is more than just one nation, but it's for all people. Because God wants all people to be saved. He wants all people to be redeemed. And even though nothing really seemed miraculous in the story of Ruth, we see something actually very miraculous. Because we see that God doesn't work with just coincidence. He is molding it into what he wants it to be for the upper story. And whenever we look at this and we start looking at our own lives, we start looking at how our lives may not have anything miraculous in them. And we may be thinking that we have suffered great loss in our lives. And we may be thinking, how in the world could God use me? We need to have faith that God can weave and mold our stories into his upper story to do great and amazing things. Because I am sure that Ruth and Rahab never thought to themselves, one day, through us, the Messiah will come. And I'm sure that many of us never think that through us, God can do great things. Yet whenever we have faith in him and we trust in him, he can. Let's pray.